A wealthy woman walks into a luxury car dealership, confident, entitled, and makes the worst mistake of her life. She insults a man she assumes doesn't belong, demands Big Shaq be thrown out. But what she doesn't know? He owns the place. As the world watches, her past resurfaces, secrets unravel, and one decision changes everything. But when Shaquille O'Neal is faced with a choice, expose her or challenge her to change, what happens next is beyond anyone's expectations. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, known to most as Big Shaq, wasn't just another millionaire businessman. He was a man with a past, a story carved out of struggle, resilience, and an unshakable belief in kindness. To the world, he was a larger-than-life figure, 7 feet of pure presence, a basketball legend turned entrepreneur. But beyond the fame, beyond the wealth, he was something far greater. A man who understood the weight of being underestimated. His luxury car dealership, O'Neal Prestige Motors, stood as a testament to everything he had built. Nestled in the heart of a thriving city, the dealership wasn't just a place where high-end cars exchanged hands. It was a beacon of ambition. Customers walked in expecting Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and Lamborghinis. But what they often walked out with was something more, an experience they'd never forget. On any given day, the showroom gleamed under bright lights, the polished floors reflecting the elegance of machines worth more than some people's lifetime earnings. Sales executives, dressed in crisp suits, maneuvered around clients with well-rehearsed pitches, while mechanics worked behind glass walls, fine-tuning engines that purred like wild animals waiting to be unleashed. Outside, valets in black uniforms stood ready, their eyes scanning the endless stream of luxury vehicles pulling in. It was a world of status, of money, of silent competition between the city's elite. But Shaq saw things differently. Unlike the customers who valued price tags more than principles, he had built this empire with something deeper in mind. Every car sold wasn't just a transaction, it was a story. He remembered the kid who had walked in with his mother, just looking at cars for fun, until Shaq surprised them by handing the boy a toy model of the same car he admired. He remembered the struggling young man who had saved every dime to buy his dream car, only for Shaq to slash the price just because he could. To Shaq, success wasn't about how much he had, it was about how much he could give. But that generosity, that kindness, had never been enough to shield him from the one thing that always lingered in the shadows: racism. Shaq had felt it his whole life. It came in different forms: the microaggressions disguised as jokes, the skeptical glances when he walked into an upscale restaurant, the hushed voices of those who refused to believe a black man could sit at the top without someone else pulling the strings. He had learned to brush it off, to let his success speak louder than their prejudice. But on this particular day, something felt off. He leaned against the glass window of his office, gazing down at the dealership floor below. His eyes flicked between customers and employees, catching subtle moments. An older man inspecting a Porsche with a critical eye, a young couple arguing over financing options, a salesman flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything seemed normal, and yet, an unsettling feeling crept in. Shaq turned to his assistant, Donovan, a sharp-minded man who had been with him for years. "You feel that?" Shaq asked, his deep voice carrying a weight of unspoken concern. Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Feel what?" Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know. Something's about to happen." Donovan smirked. "Boss, you own the best damn dealership in the city. People are always up to something." Shaq chuckled, but the feeling didn't leave him. He had been in enough locker rooms, enough boardrooms, enough situations to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. Then, just as he was about to brush it off, the glass doors swung open, and she walked in. A woman in her mid-50s, dressed in an expensive beige coat, her blonde hair styled to perfection, her heels clicking against the floor with an air of entitlement. She scanned the showroom with narrowed eyes, not in admiration, but in silent judgment. The kind of look Shaq had seen before, the kind that said, "I don't expect to see people like you here." Shaq didn't move. He just observed. The woman walked toward the nearest sales associate, her expression shifting into one of immediate displeasure. She gestured toward the showroom, as if something were offensively out of place. The salesman nodded politely, but Shaq could see it in his posture. He was uncomfortable. The woman's voice, sharp and edged with authority, floated across the room. "Is there a manager here? I'd like to speak with someone qualified." Shaq already knew where this was going. Donovan, who had been watching from the office doorway, let out a low whistle. "Wanna bet she's about to say something real stupid?" Shaq smirked, pushing off the glass. "I don't take bets I know I'll win." He made his way down to the showroom, his towering frame moving effortlessly through the space. He didn't need to announce his presence. It was felt the moment he stepped forward. The woman turned at the sound of his approach, her gaze landing on him. For a split second, Shaq saw it, the flicker of realization that he wasn't just another employee. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. She didn't see Shaquille O'Neal, the businessman. She saw a tall black man standing in a place she didn't think he belonged. And that was all it took. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She folded her arms. And then, with a voice dripping in condescension, she uttered the words that would set everything into motion. "You. What are you doing here?" Shaq didn't blink, didn't flinch. But deep down he knew. This wasn't just another day at the dealership. This was about to become something much bigger. The air inside O'Neal Prestige Motors carried the usual mix of luxury, the faint scent of leather, the soft hum of quiet conversations, and the gleam of showroom lights bouncing off polished chrome. Customers moved from one car to another, some running their hands along the sleek frames of Lamborghinis, others murmuring over financing options. It was a world of wealth, exclusivity, and quiet competition. But the moment Margot Van Doren walked in, the atmosphere shifted. Margot was the kind of woman who had spent her life believing she belonged to a different class. With her tailored beige coat, pearl earrings, and perfectly styled platinum blonde hair, she walked as if she owned the air around her. Every step was calculated, her chin slightly lifted, eyes scanning the room with the critical gaze of someone who had never been told no. She paused at the entrance, her fingers adjusting the gold bracelet on her wrist, as she took in the dealership's clientele. Then her gaze landed on Shaquille O'Neal, standing near the glass window, hands in his pockets, observing the room with quiet authority. To anyone who knew, he was the owner, the man who had built this empire. But Margot didn't know, and more importantly, she didn't care. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached the nearest sales associate, Greg, a young man barely out of college, who had been mid-conversation with a couple looking at a Rolls-Royce. Sensing the tension, he hesitated, flashing an apologetic look to the couple before turning to Margot with a polished smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Margot barely acknowledged him, her eyes still darting toward Shaq. "Who's in charge here?" she asked, her tone clipped and expectant. Greg straightened. "That would be... I assume it's not him," Margot interrupted, jerking her chin in Shaq's direction. Greg hesitated. The weight of the question settled between them. He glanced at Shaq, who had noticed the exchange but hadn't moved. "Actually, ma'am," Greg started, his voice measured. "Mr. O'Neal..." "Never mind." She cut him off, already making her way across the showroom toward Shaq. The moment she reached him, Margot's entire demeanor shifted into something that resembled forced politeness, the kind that dripped with condescension, the kind that masked itself as civility, but never quite hid the venom beneath. She studied him for a beat, as if trying to figure out why he was standing there, relaxed, confident, not fitting into the category she expected. "You," she said, her voice a shade too sharp. "Are you one of the salespeople?" Shaq didn't react immediately. He had encountered people like her before. He recognized the tone, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way she squared her shoulders as if readying herself to establish dominance in a space she assumed she controlled. He gave her a slow, easy smile. "Something like that," he said. Margot pursed her lips. "I need assistance. Someone who actually knows these cars. The real manager, perhaps?" A quiet pause settled between them. Shaq could feel eyes shifting in their direction. Employees, customers, all aware that something wasn't right. No one spoke, but the tension hummed like a live wire beneath the surface. Shaq studied her, his expression unreadable. "What are you looking for?" Margot let out an exasperated sigh. I'm here for a car, obviously, but I'd prefer to deal with someone more professional. There it was. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Shaq had spent years learning the coded language of people like Margot. Professional wasn't about expertise. It wasn't about skill. It was about power, about who she believed was worthy of having it. Ah, Shaq said, nodding slightly. I see. Margot tilted her head. Do you? Shaq's eyes flickered with something. Amusement, restraint, something unspoken that made the moment feel heavier than it should have. He could have ended it there, could have revealed the truth, shut her down in an instant. But he didn't, because he wanted to see how far she would take it. Margot sighed impatiently, scanning the room. Is there someone else I can speak to? Someone who actually knows how to handle a high-value sale? Greg, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. Other employees exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions a mix of unease and silent concern. They all knew who Shaq was. They knew he could end this conversation with a single sentence. But he didn't. Instead, he just watched her. Margot mistook his silence for hesitation. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, as if offering him some kind of advice. Look, I know people like you don't usually deal with customers like me, so let's not waste each other's time. Shaq's jaw tightened just slightly, but his expression didn't change. He had been called many things in his life. Too big, too loud, too black, too rich to be taken seriously. He had heard it all. But what always interested him was watching how people revealed themselves, how they unraveled when they believed they had the upper hand. He let the moment stretch, let her believe she was in control. Then finally, he spoke. You think I don't belong here, don't you? Margot's posture stiffened. I never said that. You didn't have to, Shaq said smoothly. It's all over your face. For the first time, Margot faltered. Just for a second. Then, just as quickly, she recovered, her expression shifting into something almost defensive. I simply expect a certain level of service, she said. Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering her words. And what level is that? Margot hesitated, then gave a tight smile. The kind that understands people like me. The words hit the air like a slap, and this time, everyone heard them. A hush fell over the showroom. Even customers who had been minding their own business suddenly became very interested in the interaction happening near the glass windows. Shaq exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The storm that had been brewing beneath his calm exterior edged closer, but he kept it contained. He had dealt with worse. He wasn't about to lose his temper over a woman who had already lost the fight. She just didn't know it yet. Greg, looking like he might jump out of his own skin, finally spoke up. Mrs. Van Doren, But Margot wasn't paying attention anymore. She was already making her next move. You know what? She said, straightening her coat, her voice sharp with manufactured politeness. I think I'd rather take my business elsewhere. She turned on her heel, fully prepared to walk out and leave behind whatever mess she had just made. But then, that's a shame, Shaq said, voice even, smooth. Especially since I own the place. Margot froze mid-step. The words didn't register immediately, not fully. She turned back slowly, her lips parting, but no sound came out. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Shaq watched the realization wash over her, the slow unraveling of certainty in her eyes. The room held its breath. Greg shifted, employees tensed. Margot blinked, swallowed, looked around as if waiting for someone to correct him, but no one did. And that was when she knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. A heavy silence settled over the dealership. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Shaq watched as Margot Van Doren struggled to process what he had just said. She blinked once, twice, her polished demeanor cracking at the edges. The confidence she had walked in with, the air of superiority she had so effortlessly carried, had just been yanked out from beneath her. You own this place? She repeated, the disbelief clear in her voice. Shaq simply nodded. His expression remained calm, unreadable. Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, a desperate attempt to regain control. Well, she scoffed, adjusting her coat. I find that very hard to believe. The tension in the showroom thickened. Employees stood frozen, their eyes darting between Shaq and Margot. Customers, who had initially pretended not to notice the exchange, were now openly watching. Even those who had been focused on car purchases had turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Margot straightened her shoulders, grasping onto the last remnants of her authority. This is absurd, she declared. Why would someone like you own a place like this? Shaq let out a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He had been through this before, countless times. The doubt, the condescension, the disbelief that a black man could be the one in charge. He had spent his entire life proving people like Margot wrong. But today, he wasn't in the mood to explain himself. He had given her a chance to recognize her mistake, a chance to step back before she fell too deep into the hole she was digging. But she wasn't stopping. Margot turned to Greg, the young sales associate who had tried and failed to intervene earlier. This is a joke, she snapped. I demand to speak to the real manager. Greg hesitated. His gaze flickered to Shaq, then back to Margot. Mrs. Van Doren, No, she cut him off, her voice rising. Enough of this nonsense. This man is harassing me. I come in here looking to buy a car, and I'm accosted by some random person pretending to be the owner. She gestured toward Shaq with an exaggerated wave of her hand. This is completely inappropriate. A murmur spread through the room. Employees shifted uncomfortably. A few customers whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Shaq remained perfectly still. His patience was wearing thin, but he had one rule he never broke. Never let them see you lose control. Margot's voice turned sharper. I want security to remove him immediately. This is harassment. Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around helplessly, but Margot wasn't waiting for a response. She was already turning, her manicured fingers reaching for the nearest employee behind the front desk. You, she said, pointing at the receptionist. Call the manager right now. I will not stand here and be disrespected. Shaq let out a quiet sigh and turned his head slightly toward Donovan, his longtime assistant, who had been watching the entire situation unfold from a few feet away. Donovan raised an eyebrow. You want me to handle this? He asked under his breath. Shaq shook his head. Not yet. Margot had embarrassed herself enough already, but he wanted to see just how far she would take it. The receptionist hesitated before reaching for the phone. Before she could dial, however, the glass doors at the entrance swung open and two uniformed security guards stepped inside. Margot's eyes lit up with triumph. Finally, she huffed, turning to them. I need you to remove this man from the premises immediately. The guards, James and Rico, had been working at O'Neill Prestige Motors for years. They knew Shaq personally. They knew exactly who owned this place. James exchanged a glance with Rico before looking at Shaq. He raised a questioning eyebrow. Shaq gave him the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Margot mistook their hesitation for incompetence. Are you deaf? She snapped. I said get him out. James cleared his throat. Ma'am, what exactly is the issue here? Margot rolled her eyes, exasperated. The issue is that this man is bothering me. He refuses to leave me alone, and when I asked for someone in charge, he had the audacity to say that She let out a sharp laugh. That he owns the dealership. Can you believe that? Rico's face remained neutral, but the corner of his mouth twitched. He was holding back a smirk. James shifted his stance, folding his arms across his chest. And you want us to remove him? Yes, Margot snapped. Silence. Then James spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. Ma'am, he said, tilting his head slightly. That man right there? That's Shaquille O'Neal. He does own this dealership. Margot froze. The color drained from her face. A ringing silence filled the air. The watching employees held their breath, their expressions a mix of amusement and discomfort. For a moment, Margot didn't move. She didn't blink. She had no words. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in, but her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. That's ridiculous, she stammered. This must be some kind of joke. James didn't smile. No joke, ma'am. Mr. O'Neill owns this entire dealership. You just demanded that we throw out the owner of the business you're trying to buy a car from." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margot's hands curled into fists. Her breathing grew uneven. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath. This is some kind of setup." Shaq finally stepped forward. He took his time, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. When he spoke, his voice was measured, calm, but firm. "I gave you every chance," he said quietly. "I let you dig your own grave, and you did it beautifully." Margot's eyes snapped to him, her lips parting. Shaq held up a hand. "Save it," he said. "You saw a black man in a luxury dealership, and you assumed he didn't belong. You assumed I was an employee. Then, when I didn't immediately cater to you, you tried to have me thrown out of my own business." Margot swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled at her sides. Shaq took a slow step forward. "You humiliated yourself," he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not me." Margot looked around, desperate to find an escape. But there was none. The employees wouldn't meet her eyes. The customers whispered among themselves. Even Greg, the nervous sales associate, had taken a careful step away. She had lost. Completely. Shaq took a breath, then gave a small, almost pitying shake of his head. "Now," he said, "you have two options. You can apologize and walk out with whatever dignity you have left. Or," he glanced around the room, "you can keep going, and we'll see just how much more damage you can do to yourself." Margot's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Her pride warred with reality. But she knew. This wasn't her world anymore. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her face flushed with humiliation. She didn't say another word. The moment the doors shut behind her, a quiet chuckle broke the silence. Then another. And then, laughter spread through the showroom like wildfire. Shaq simply turned to Greg and clapped him on the shoulder. "Let's get back to selling some cars." And just like that, the moment was over. But for Margot Van Doren, the humiliation had only just begun. For a few agonizing seconds, no one spoke. The air inside O'Neill Prestige Motors felt different now, thick with tension and silent disbelief. Margot Van Doren stood stiff, her face frozen in an unnatural expression of shock, the color draining from her skin as her mind worked overtime to process what had just been said. "The owner?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She blinked once, twice, as if trying to reset reality. Surely this was some kind of mistake, some kind of joke. James, the security guard, crossed his arms over his chest, shifting his weight slightly. "Yeah, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but edged with amusement. "Mr. O'Neill owns the entire dealership." Margot's gaze jerked back to Shaq, her posture rigid. "You," she started, but her voice cracked. Shaq raised an eyebrow. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything but let the moment stretch. Let her sit in the weight of her own actions. Her breathing turned shallow, her hands clenching at her sides. She scanned the faces around her, desperate for some sort of lifeline. But there was none. Only judgment. Only the realization that she had humiliated herself in front of an audience that wouldn't forget. She shook her head slightly, letting out a breathy laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. That can't be right." Shaq tilted his head. "Why not?" Margot flinched, caught in her own trap. She had no answer that wouldn't condemn her further. Greg, the young sales associate who had been too nervous to speak earlier, now straightened his spine and took a step closer. His voice was firmer this time, less hesitant. "It's true, Mrs. Van Doren. Mr. O'Neill is the owner of this dealership." Margot's gaze flickered to him, desperate. "But I sign his paychecks," Shaq interrupted, his deep voice calm, almost casual, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Another murmur rippled through the showroom. Customers, employees, everyone was watching, waiting for what would happen next. Margot's face twisted into something ugly for a brief second, before she schooled her expression, smoothing her coat like she could somehow iron out the damage she had just done. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly, trying to regain control. I didn't know. If someone had told me, I wouldn't have." Shaq let out a slow breath, his patience thinning. Wouldn't have what? Margot hesitated. He took a step closer, not looming, not threatening, just present. Unshakable. Wouldn't have treated me like I didn't belong? Wouldn't have assumed I was beneath you? Margot flushed. I didn't mean it like that. Didn't you? Shaq's tone wasn't angry. It was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. Margot was sinking fast, and she knew it. I thought you were an employee, she stammered. You were just standing there. How was I supposed to know? Shaq studied her for a long, quiet moment. Then, he exhaled, shaking his head. You weren't supposed to know, he said simply. You were just supposed to treat people with respect. Doesn't matter if they're the owner, an employee, or someone just walking through the door. Margot opened her mouth, then shut it. And that was the moment she realized there was no way out. No excuse, no defense, no backpedaling that would erase what she had done. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was exposed. The employees who had once hesitated to intervene were now standing behind Shaq, silent but firm, their expressions making it clear where their loyalty lay. The tension had shifted. This wasn't just Margot against Shaq anymore. This was Margot against the entire room. A slow, suffocating panic flickered in her eyes. She wasn't used to being the one on the losing side. She was the one who made people feel small. She was the one who had power. But here now, she had none. She forced a smile, a weak, brittle thing. Well, this has all been quite the misunderstanding, she said, laughing lightly, as if she could brush it all away. I didn't mean to offend anyone. Shaq simply watched her. You did, though. Margot's smile faltered. She swallowed. I'd still like to look at the cars. Perhaps we can start over. A sharp breath of disbelief came from Donovan. Greg outright snorted. Even James, the security guard, had to cover his mouth with his fist to stop a laugh. Margot was still trying to pretend like she hadn't burned every bridge in the room. Shaq let the silence drag out, let the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Then, he finally spoke. I don't think we have anything left to discuss, Mrs. Van Doren, he said. His voice was steady, unreadable. My team has the right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects them, and that includes me. Margot's head jerked up, shock flashing in her eyes. You're refusing to sell me a car? Shaq shrugged. I'm refusing to waste my time. A collective inhale swept through the showroom. Margot's face turned a deep shade of red. For the first time, the reality of her situation fully sank in. Shaq wasn't going to fight her. He wasn't going to argue, wasn't going to get angry. He was simply going to walk away. And that, somehow, was worse. Margot had expected confrontation, had expected raised voices, expected something that would let her spin this into a different story. Instead, she had been dismissed. Like she didn't matter. Like she wasn't worth another second of his time. Her jaw tightened, her entire body going rigid. This is unacceptable, she hissed, her voice trembling. You think you can treat me this way? Shaq tilted his head, amused. You mean the way you treated me? Margot's breath hitched. And then finally, she had nothing left to say. The humiliation was complete. With a final sharp inhale, she spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her departure just as loud as her arrival, but for a very different reason. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The doors swung shut behind her, and the room sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then, a low chuckle, then another. And then, just like that, laughter rippled through the room, quiet at first, then growing. Not cruel, not loud. Just the kind of laugh that comes when justice is served in the simplest way possible. Shaq turned to Greg, clapping him on the shoulder. Now, he said, his voice lighter than it had been all day. Who wants to actually sell a car today? The tension broke completely, and the dealership returned to normal, the moment fading into the background, except in the minds of those who had witnessed it, because no one in that room would ever forget the day Margot Van Doren tried to throw Shaquille O'Neal out of his own dealership. The video hit the internet before Margot Van Doren even made it to her car. A young woman named Chelsea Novak, a college student who had been browsing the showroom with her boyfriend, had instinctively started recording the moment Margot's voice had risen. She hadn't planned to post it. Not at first. But as she sat in the passenger seat, replaying the footage of the entire encounter, she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. Her caption was simple. Rich white lady tries to throw Shaquille O'Neal out of his own dealership. This is wild. Stay humble. Within minutes, the video had thousands of views. Within hours, it had millions. The internet was on fire. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit. Everywhere you looked, the video was being reposted, dissected, and debated. How do you try to throw out Shaq? Shaq you. The man is 7 feet tall. How do you miss that? The patience this man had. If it were me? Couldn't be me. She really said someone more professional. Ma'am, that's a literal NBA legend and millionaire businessman. POV, you just ruined your own life in 4K. The internet did what it does best, dug into Margot's past. Within 24 hours, her full name, her family's country club affiliations, and even her old Facebook posts were circulating. Screenshots from local news reports from years ago surfaced, articles about Margot being involved in a racially insensitive incident at a private gala. Her LinkedIn profile vanished overnight. So did her social media accounts, but it was too late. By the next morning, mainstream news outlets had picked up the story. CNN, NBC, even international networks were reporting on it. Luxury car dealership incident sparks nationwide debate on racial profiling. Shaquille O'Neal's classy response to racism wins hearts online. Every headline framed Shaq as the composed, dignified entrepreneur and Margot as the privileged woman whose arrogance had destroyed her reputation. Margot's own community turned on her. People who had once called her a friend suddenly had nothing to say. Businesses she was associated with quietly removed her name from their boards. And then came the fallout she never saw coming. It started with her country club membership being revoked. The board had a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, something they only enforced when it became a PR nightmare. Then, her husband's law firm released a statement distancing itself from her. The message was vague but clear. The views expressed by Mrs. Van Doren do not reflect those of our firm. Her real estate license was suspended, pending review by the ethics committee. And the worst part? Her own children were being dragged into it. Her son's university issued a statement condemning racism and reaffirming its values of diversity and inclusion. Her daughter's private school distanced itself from her publicly. Margot tried to issue an apology, but by then, no one cared. The damage was done. While the internet roasted Margot alive, Shaq remained completely silent. No tweets, no interviews, no public statements. The world waited, expecting him to say something. Anything. Then, on the third day, he finally spoke. A single Instagram post, a picture of his dealership. The caption? Treat people right. Always. Nothing more. No call-outs. No victory lap. That single post shattered records. Celebrities, athletes, and business moguls flooded the comments with support. LeBron James. You handled that like a king, big fella. Michelle Obama. Grace and dignity always win. Thank you for leading by example. Jeff Bezos. I need a new car, Shaq. Save me a spot at the dealership. Shaq's business boomed overnight. Sales skyrocketed. People who had never considered buying a luxury car suddenly wanted to give their money to the man who had handled blatant racism with nothing but composure. Just as the dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. A mysterious email arrived in Shaq's inbox. The subject line was simple. I need to talk. It was from Margot Van Doren. Shaq sat back in his office chair, exhaling as he stared at the screen. He hadn't expected this. Not this soon. He opened the email. Mr. O'Neal, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Not for the cameras. Not for social media. Just you and me. Please. He leaned forward, rubbing his jaw. He didn't know if this was a desperate attempt at damage control or something else entirely. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. Shaq stared at his screen. The email from Margot Van Doren sat there, waiting. A single unread message that carried more weight than it should have. She wanted to talk. Not for the cameras, not for social media. Just him and her. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't sure why he hadn't deleted it immediately. Maybe part of him was curious. Maybe part of him wanted to hear her out. But deep down, he didn't trust her. For the past 3 days, Margot had been the center of public scrutiny. The internet had torn through her life with surgical precision, exposing things she had spent years burying. And now, a secret from her past had come to light. It started as a small Reddit thread, buried beneath thousands of memes and reactions to the viral video. Someone had recognized Margot. Not from the dealership incident, but from somewhere else. Within hours, an old article surfaced from a local Florida newspaper, dated nearly 20 years ago. Prominent socialite accused of discriminatory practices at exclusive gala. Shaq clicked the link, scanning the article quickly. The details were chillingly familiar. An upscale charity event. A wealthy white woman. A black server humiliated in front of a crowd. Margot had been the woman in question. The article described how she had publicly berated a young black waiter, demanding he be removed from the event after accusing him of stealing her bracelet. A bracelet later found in her own purse. No apology. No consequences. The waiter, a college student at the time, had lost his job after the incident. Margot had walked away untouched. Until now. Shaq exhaled through his nose, staring at the screen. So this wasn't new for her. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something told him to answer. Hello? A deep, steady voice responded. Mr. O'Neill? Speaking. The man on the other end hesitated, then spoke carefully. I think you should know. I was that waiter. Shaq's posture stiffened. The waiter from the article. The young man Margot had humiliated all those years ago. What's your name? Shaq asked, leaning forward. A pause. David Ellis. Shaq repeated the name in his head. It felt significant, like something from another life, something connected to a deeper truth. David sighed. I wasn't going to say anything, but after what happened to you, I couldn't stay quiet. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. Tell me everything. David's voice was measured, steady, but laced with something heavier. I was 20 at the time, working the event to pay my way through school. It was supposed to be just another night. Rich people, fancy tables, overpriced food. I kept my head down, did my job. Then Margot singled me out. Shaq closed his eyes, picturing it. The gleaming chandeliers, the clinking glasses, the polite laughter that could turn cold in an instant. She accused me of stealing her bracelet, David continued. Right there, in the middle of the ballroom. Called security. Had the whole room staring at me like I was some kind of criminal. Shaq felt a slow burn in his chest. It was the same pattern, the same arrogance, the same entitlement. They searched me, in front of everyone, David said. My pockets, my tray even made me empty my shoes. And the whole time she stood there watching, drinking her champagne like she was enjoying a damn show. Shaq's jaw tightened. And then, David continued, voice darkening, they found the bracelet, in her purse. Shaq exhaled. She didn't apologize, David said, his voice quieter now. Didn't even look at me, just laughed it off and told the guests it was a misunderstanding. My boss still fired me, said I made the guests uncomfortable. Silence stretched between them. Shaq leaned forward, pressing his fingers to his temple. This wasn't just about a viral moment. This was a pattern. A lifetime of believing she could do whatever she wanted to people like him, people like David. David cleared his throat. I don't need anything from you, Mr. O'Neill. I just thought you should know. This isn't the first time she's done this. And if she's reaching out to you now, she's not looking for forgiveness. She's looking for a way to clean up her mess. Shaq let the words settle. David was right. That night, Shaq sat alone in his office, staring at Margot's email. His first instinct? Expose her. The internet already had the pieces. All it would take was one post, one confirmation from him, and Margot's name would be permanently cemented in history as a serial racist. She deserved it, didn't she? She had ruined David's life. She had tried to humiliate Shaq. She had spent her whole existence stepping on people without consequence. But then another thought crept in. What if this was an opportunity? What if, for the first time in her life, Margot Van Doren was forced to confront the truth about herself? Was that even possible? Could someone like her change? Shaq sighed, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't about whether she deserved forgiveness. It was about what came next. Would he destroy her? Or would he give her one last chance to make things right? The decision weighed heavy. And by morning, he knew what he had to do. Shaq sat in his office, the early morning light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Margot's email was still open on his screen, her desperate words lingering in his mind. She wanted to talk, not for the cameras, not for social media, just him and her. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk. His first instinct had been to ignore her, let her sit in the wreckage of her own making, let her feel the weight of consequences for the first time in her privileged life. But then he thought about David Ellis. He thought about the young man Margot had humiliated 2 decades ago, about how her accusations had stolen his dignity, his job, his future. He thought about all the other people she had probably stepped on, insulted, dismissed as less than, people who hadn't had the luxury of a viral moment to set things right. And then, he thought about himself, about the first time he had felt the sting of being seen as an outsider in his own country, about the teachers who assumed he wasn't smart enough, about the business partners who talked to him, but not with him, about the boardrooms full of wealthy executives who still, even after all his success, questioned if he truly belonged. He had spent years proving them wrong, and yet, here he was, still dealing with the same ignorance. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if people like Margot could change, but if there was even a chance she could, wasn't that more powerful than vengeance? He reached for his phone. It was time to find out. They met at a private lounge in the city, far from the cameras, far from the noise. Shaq had chosen the location carefully, neutral ground. Margot arrived 10 minutes early. She looked different. The arrogance she had carried in the dealership was gone. The designer coat was replaced with something simpler. Her hair was still styled, but there was something tired about her now, like the weight of the last few days had settled onto her shoulders. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. When Shaq entered, she stood quickly, as if unsure of what to do. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, her voice hesitant. Shaq sat across from her, studying her carefully. He could see the nervous energy in her posture. The way she kept glancing around, as if expecting someone to jump out and expose her all over again. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, "You wanted to talk?" Margot exhaled shakily, nodding. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know where to begin." Shaq leaned back. "Try the truth." She swallowed. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Margot flinched. She stopped, pressing her lips together. She looked down at her hands. "I was raised to believe certain things," she said finally, "to behave a certain way, and I never thought to question it. I never thought—" She trailed off. Shaq let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. "And now?" Margot looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "Now, I don't know who I am anymore." Shaq studied her. He could see the fear in her, not just fear of public backlash, fear of being truly seen. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, only to realize that the world had changed while she hadn't. Shaq leaned forward. "You don't get to make this go away with an apology." Margot swallowed. "I know. You don't get to walk out of here thinking you've learned your lesson just because your reputation took a hit." Her throat bobbed. "I know that too." Shaq exhaled slowly. He didn't fully believe her yet. But if she was here, sitting in front of him, willing to listen, maybe there was a chance. He made his decision. "You want to make things right?" he asked. Margot nodded quickly. "Yes." "Then here's what you're going to do." Shaq laid it out plain and simple. She would take part in a community outreach program, one that worked directly with Black-owned businesses and underprivileged communities. She would attend racial bias training, not just for show but for actual learning. She would go face to face with people whose lives had been affected by discrimination, people who had suffered because of attitudes like hers. And most importantly, she would do it quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no staged moments of redemption. This wasn't about repairing her reputation. It was about repairing the damage she had caused. Margot stared at him, wide-eyed. "You can say no," Shaq said, his tone even. "You can walk out of here and go back to whatever's left of your life. But if you're serious about change, this is how it starts." Margot hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly as she toyed with the hem of her sleeve. For the first time in her life, she was not in control. She had spent years dictating the terms, deciding who mattered, deciding who belonged. But now, she was on the other side, and she had a choice to make. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she nodded, slowly, reluctantly, but sincerely. "I'll do it," she whispered. Shaq didn't nod, didn't react, because now the real test would begin. That night, Shaq sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. Had he made the right choice? Would Margot actually change? Or would she pretend for a while, then slip back into old habits? He wasn't sure. But he did know one thing. Vengeance felt good for a moment. But change? Real change? That lasted forever. Margot Van Doren had spent her entire life in control. She controlled the spaces she walked into, the people she surrounded herself with, the conversations she engaged in. Power was something she never had to question. It had always been hers. Until now. Now, she wasn't the one making the rules. Now, she wasn't the one who got to decide how this played out. And it terrified her. Shaq had given her a choice: do the work or disappear. She had chosen the work. But deep down, even she wasn't sure if she truly wanted to change, or if she was just desperate to salvage what little was left of her reputation. The world was watching, and so was Shaq. Shaq didn't ease her into it. There was no warm welcome, no hand-holding. Her first assignment was at a community outreach center in South Atlanta, a nonprofit that helped underprivileged youth, kids who had grown up in the same world Margot had spent her life ignoring. When she arrived, the tension was immediate. The director, Monica Ray, a sharp-eyed black woman in her late 40s, greeted her with crossed arms and a look that screamed, "I don't have time for this." "So," Monica said, voice clipped, "you're here because you got caught being a racist, and now you want to feel better about yourself?" Margot stiffened. She could feel the judgment in the room, burning into her like a brand. "I'm here because—" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Because I have no other choice? Because Shaquille O'Neal told me to? Because I'm trying to fix what I did?" But what had she actually done? She had tried to shrink a man in his own space. She had humiliated herself, yes, but the real damage had been to the people who had seen her as a reminder of the world they were forced to navigate every single day. Margot swallowed, pushing through the discomfort. "I'm here to listen," she finally said. Monica studied her, unimpressed. "Then let's see if you're actually capable of that." Her first task was simple: sit and listen. She was led into a circle of young adults, most of them barely out of their teens, each with a story of how racism had shaped their lives. Devin, 19, had been arrested at 14 because he fit the description. He had spent 6 months in juvie for a crime he didn't commit. Renee, 22, had been denied housing 3 times despite having a perfect rental history. The landlord suddenly lost interest when they met her in person. Troy, 18, had watched his father, a war veteran, be disrespected in a restaurant by people who looked just like Margot. As they spoke, Margot sat there, stiff and silent. No one yelled at her, no one cussed her out. But their words cut deeper than any insult ever could, because for the first time in her life, she couldn't escape it. She couldn't dismiss it as someone overreacting. She couldn't hide behind the illusion that things weren't as bad as people said. It was right in front of her, raw, real, undeniable. By the time the last story was told, her hands were trembling, and she didn't even know why. The confrontation that nearly broke her. A week later, Shaq sent her to meet David Ellis. She knew who he was before he even spoke. She had seen the news, the resurfaced article, the old, grainy photo of a young black man in a white waiter's uniform standing in a ballroom he never truly belonged in. Margot sat across from him in a quiet cafe, the smell of coffee thick in the air. David didn't look at her right away. He took his time, and when he finally did speak, his voice was calm but sharp. "You don't remember me, do you?" Margot swallowed. She didn't, not really, not beyond the news reports, not beyond what she had been forced to see. But he remembered her. Vividly. "You ruined my life," David said bluntly, "and you never even noticed." Margot's chest tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to say she hadn't meant it, that it was so long ago, but she knew deep down that none of that mattered. "I'm sorry," she said, the words small, weak. David exhaled, shaking his head. "You think that changes anything?" Margot blinked. You walked into a room, saw a black kid working a job, and decided I was a criminal," he said coldly. "And because of that, I lost everything. I lost my job, my scholarship, my home, all because a rich white woman pointed a finger and said, 'He did it.'" His voice didn't rise. He didn't yell. But it was devastating. Margot forced herself to hold his gaze, even as her stomach twisted. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. David leaned forward. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "But you have to decide. Are you actually going to change, or is this just about making yourself feel better?" Margot didn't have an answer, because she didn't know. As weeks passed, the internet hadn't forgotten. People followed her every move. There were still articles, still debates. Some people believed she was actually trying. Others thought she was just playing the long game, waiting for the heat to die down. Shaq watched from a distance. He didn't interfere, didn't help, didn't guide. Because this was her fight. She had to choose who she was going to be now. 2 months after their first meeting, Shaq called Margot to his office. She arrived looking different. There was no more desperate politeness, no fake smiles. She looked tired, but not weak. Shaq sat across from her. "So," he said. "Tell me." Margot exhaled slowly. "I don't think I'll ever undo the damage I've caused," she admitted. "I don't think I'll ever be the person I was before this." Shaq nodded. "Good." Margot looked up, surprised. Shaq leaned forward. "The goal wasn't for you to go back to who you were," he said. "The goal was for you to see the world as it really is." Margot swallowed. "And now that I do?" Shaq studied her carefully. He could still expose her, could still destroy what was left of her reputation. But as he looked at her now, he realized he didn't need to. Because the old Margot? She was already gone. And what came next was up to her. Shaq sat behind his desk, hands folded, studying Margot. She looked different from the woman who had strutted into his dealership weeks ago, drowning in arrogance and entitlement. Now she sat before him, her posture unsure, her face lined with exhaustion. The transformation was real, but was it enough? For weeks he had watched her struggle through the program he had set up. He had seen the moments when she seemed to genuinely listen, but he had also seen the doubt in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear, and now, it was time to decide what came next. Margot swallowed, sensing the weight of the moment. "I know I can't undo the past," she said carefully, "but I want to do better." Shaq nodded slowly. "And what does better look like to you?" Margot hesitated. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head a dozen times, but now, faced with Shaq's steady gaze, every scripted answer felt hollow. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I'm willing to keep learning." Shaq leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had a decision to make. Would he let her move on? Or would he be the one to permanently expose her past, ensuring she could never escape it? But before he could respond, Donovan knocked on the door, stepping in without waiting. His face was tense, eyes flickering to Margot before settling on Shaq. "You need to see this," he said, holding out his phone. Shaq took it, frowning as he read the screen. And then, his expression shifted. Margot watched him carefully. "What is it?" she asked. Shaq didn't answer at first. He just stared at the phone, processing what he had just learned. Because everything he thought he knew about Margot Van Doren had just changed. The article on Donovan's phone wasn't about Margot's racism. It wasn't about her wealth, her privilege, or her past mistakes. It was about her father. Richard Van Doren, a name that carried weight in old money circles, was being exposed in a breaking news investigation, one that detailed his long history of illegal business dealings, political bribes, and most disturbingly, direct contributions to known white supremacist organizations. Margot's father wasn't just an elitist snob. He was a calculated, dangerous man, one who had built his empire on discrimination, power, and fear. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. He looked up at Margot, who was watching him with growing unease. "You knew about this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Margot hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yes." A slow wave of silence filled the room. Shaq exhaled, setting the phone down. "And you never thought to stop it?" Margot let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You think I had a choice?" She leaned forward, something flashing in her eyes. "You think growing up in that house was easy? That I had any say in the kind of man my father was?" Shaq didn't respond. Margot swallowed hard. "You want the truth? Fine. My whole life I was told who to be, how to act. My father controlled everything. What I said, what I believed, even who I was allowed to associate with." She let out a shaky breath. "You think I never questioned it? You think I never saw the way he talked about people like you? People like David?" She shook her head. "I did. And every time I tried to push back, he reminded me exactly where my power came from." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "And where was that?" Margot's throat bobbed. "Him." Another silence stretched between them. Then she said something Shaq hadn't expected. "He disowned me this morning." Shaq's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. Margot laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I woke up to my bank accounts frozen, my trust fund revoked, my name wiped from every financial record my father controlled." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Turns out, actually trying to change is a punishable offense in my family." She met Shaq's eyes, her own filled with something he couldn't quite name. "You were right," she said quietly. "I did this for the wrong reasons at first. I wanted to save my reputation. I wanted to survive this scandal. But now?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Shaq studied her for a long time. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. This was about survival. Margot had spent her entire life as part of a system designed to keep people like Shaq beneath her. And now she was the one being cast out. Shaq wasn't sure how to feel about that. Margot took a slow breath, steeling herself. "So what now?" Shaq sat back, folding his arms. "That's up to you." Margot blinked. "You're not going to expose me?" Shaq shook his head. "I don't need to. Your father already did that for you." Margot let out a slow breath, as if she had been holding it for hours. Shaq leaned forward. "Here's the thing," he said, voice even. "If you're serious about changing, you don't need me to hold you accountable. You'll do it on your own." Margot swallowed. Shaq met her gaze, unflinching. "But if I ever hear that you've slipped back into your old ways, that you've used what's left of your privilege to push someone down instead of lifting them up," his voice dropped slightly, "I'll make sure the world never forgets your name." Margot nodded. She didn't argue, didn't ask for mercy, because she knew this was mercy. She stood slowly, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "Thank you," she said. Not because she expected forgiveness, but because she understood the weight of what had just happened. She turned and walked toward the door. And for the first time in her life, Margot Van Doren stepped into a world where she was no longer untouchable. As the door shut behind her, Shaq sat in silence. He could have destroyed her, could have sent out one tweet, one interview, and ruined her forever. But instead, he had done something more powerful. He had let the truth do the work for him. People like Margot had spent their entire lives hiding behind money, power, and influence. But now she had none of those things. And for the first time, she had to face the world the way everyone else did. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He wasn't sure if she would ever truly change. But the difference was, now, the choice was hers. And that was something no amount of money could control. Some people learn the hard way. Others never learn at all. This story isn't just about one woman's downfall. It's about the world we live in, the assumptions we make, and the power of accountability. So what would you have done in Shaq's place? Because in the fight between privilege and justice, the real question isn't who wins, it's who changes.